In this short video presentation, we hope to show the reason that calcium, as one of the most important nutrients in the diet of a horse, can be very much influenced by the form in which calcium is supplied, and how we need to be careful in considering certain crucial life stages to actually make sure that calcium supply is adequate. So as a mineral, calcium is one of the 5 major minerals or major nutrients, sometimes called macro minerals, that it's important to consider in equine feeding. It is particularly important at 3 life stages of the horse, that is in the last trimester of pregnancy, when the foal is growing rapidly in the uterus, in early lactation, when the mare is providing the vast majority, if not the sum total, of the diet of the growing foal, and actually when the foal is weaned and actually is existing as a free living organism in its own right. So calcium is a readily available nutrient. It's widely found in the environment. In fact, within chalk soils, calcium carbonate is a very common source of calcium, and it's sometimes provided as a supplement for horses. So why is calcium actually needed in the body? Well, it's, as most people will know, it's an important component of bone structure, and this explains why we need calcium in the life stages we've already identified, when the skeleton is being formed and when indeed the skeleton is fully formed. The other major role of calcium in the body is actually in muscle contraction, where calcium facilitates the binding of muscle proteins, actin and myosin in the leg, which achieve movement. So we're going to think about how the source of calcium, the type of calcium, is actually impacting on the availability of what is in the horse's diet. So when we're thinking about supplying supplemental calcium, as we've said, calcium comes in a number of forms. Here in a stimulated stomach vessel, I've got a sample of calivite, which is a supplement of 99% calcium carbonate. You can see it's basically just a white powder when it's ground down. In this vessel, we have a sample of calfamin, which again is a very popular and effective supplement for providing calcium to horses. And I just want to show you very simply how these 2 different materials behave in the presence of water. So here we have some pure water from the tap, and you can see when we mix it with the calivite, basically we end up with a slurry, which is really because what's happening is that the calivite is mixing with water, but it's not dissolving, so you can see that there's quite a large solid residue in the bottom. If we do the same thing with the calfamin here, put a similar volume of water. Now you can see that because calfamin is not actually a pure form of calcium as in the calivite, but it's mixed with a number of other things, we get a solution, and in this solution, in fact, most of the calcium has dissolved, because calcium in calfamin is provided as calcium orthophosphate, which is a very soluble form of calcium, whereas in the calivite containing the calcium carbonate, it's a much more insoluble form. Now, in the horse's stomach, the situation is interacted by the fact that it's a very acid medium. So what I want to show you now is how calivite or calcium carbonate behaves in the presence of hydrochloric acid, which is indeed the acid secreted by the stomach wall. And you can see that there is a lot of fizzing as the acid reacts with the calcium carbonate or the limestone. And what is happening now is that the insoluble form of calcium in the calcium carbonate is being converted to calcium chloride, which is actually much more readily soluble. But we're going to see in a minute that the amount of reactivity we get with calcium carbonate is much greater with the acid than it is with the calfamin, where we have calcium as calcium orthophosphate. And you can see there's still a residual amount of foaming as carbon dioxide is driven off as a result of that reaction. So if we now very simply just add the same material, hydrochloric acid, to the calfamin, calcium orthophosphate, you can see that there is fizzing, but it's actually much lower, at a much lower level, because calcium orthophosphate is more soluble. And the fizzing we see here actually is from calcium carbonate, which is also part of the calfamin. So we conclude from this very basic demonstration that the calcium in calfamin is much more soluble, therefore much more readily available, or bioavailable as the scientists call it, to the horse. And this helps explain its suitability, really, and its preferential use as a supplement for calcium in equids, because it is readily available. And to actually just take that to its full conclusion, we need to understand what happens to calcium in the body. So in the stomach, as we've said, a very acid medium, there is reaction. There may be dissolving of calcium, and it then passes through from the fluids of the stomach into the small intestine, and across the wall of the small intestine it's absorbed, particularly in the second and third portions, the jejunum and the ileum, where it gets into the bloodstream. So the bloodstream is, as with all nutrients, the major pool of nutrients from which the horse can use, and from the blood it may go straight to the muscle for muscle involvement and movement, or it might go to the bones, as we've seen, because bones are composed mainly of calcium and phosphorus. So this is basically underlying why the solubility of calcium is so crucial in horse nutrition and metabolism. So if the blood supply becomes depleted through inadequate calcium in the diet, the horse may then mobilize reserves from the skeleton. This, of course, weakens the skeleton if it's not replaced. So calcium deficiency in the short term may not be a major problem, but in the longer term it can crucially affect the horse's performance and indeed its skeletal structure. So calfamin, being a more readily available source of calcium, is preferred by many professionals as a means of keeping the supply at a more than adequate level, and even in the rehabilitation of horses that may actually have incurred some minor injury in their leg due to damage or accident. So the supply of calcium, as we said, just to round it all up, is very crucial to the health and well-being of a horse, and in particular in maintaining the blood supply and the reserves to the bones from which it may be mobilized for later use if necessary. So in conclusion, when we're considering the supplement which is appropriate to provide the form of calcium in for the horse, there are a range of suitable materials that can be looked at. We have calavite, for instance, the product here at the base, which, as we've seen, is mainly calcium carbonate or limestone. Less soluble in water, but under the influence of hydrochloric acid in the stomach will perform acceptably, and certainly over a longer time period. And then we have products such as DCP or dicalcium phosphate, which is certainly readily more soluble in water, or we have calfamin, where we have calcium in the form of calcium hydrogen orthophosphate, a very soluble form of calcium as a nutrient, and therefore readily taken up and absorbed into the horse's body. And this is a very popular, very effective and proven way of getting calcium into either the mare in late pregnancy, in early lactation, or indeed for foals or yearlings that have long since weaned. Plus, of course, its use in the rehabilitation of horses that actually have suffered skeletal injury.